Nessa Caulfield was standing on the third floor of a building she'd owned for 3 months. Looking through a window so thick with dust, she had to wipe it with her sleeve just to see the wheat fields dying on the other side. In her left hand, she held a tin box no bigger than a paperback novel. Inside it, a fistful of seeds that looked like they'd given up decades ago, curled dry the color of old newspapers. Below her, gravel popped under tires. A vehicle she didn't recognize pulling up slow the way people do when they want you to know they're arriving. Cal's sneakers slapped the stairs two at a time. He came around the corner, breathing hard, eyes wide, one hand still holding the pencil he'd been using to map the second floor. "Mom, there's a man in a suit, and his shoes are really clean." 3 months earlier, Nessa Caulfield was washing her son's only school shirt in a gas station bathroom sink outside Wichita. The shirt was blue with a small hole near the collar that she'd already patched twice. The patch was holding, but the fabric around it was thinning, going translucent in places, and she knew the next wash might be its last. She wrung it out, carefully pressing it flat between her palms rather than twisting, because twisting broke the fibers faster. She'd learned that from her mother, who had learned it from hers, a chain of women passing down the science of making things last longer than they were built to. The bathroom smelled like industrial soap and someone else's cigarettes. The fluorescent light above the mirror buzzed at a frequency that had been giving her a headache for the past 10 minutes. In the mirror, she looked exactly like what she was, 33 years old, 11 pounds lighter than she'd been 6 months ago, dark circles that no amount of gas station sink water was going to fix. She draped the shirt over the hand dryer and pressed the button. Warm air billowed the fabric. Cal's shirt puffing up like a small blue ghost was the most optimistic thing in the room. If you've ever wondered what it sounds like when someone's trying to hold their whole life together in a gas station bathroom, it sounds like a hand dryer running for the third cycle because the shirt isn't dry yet and the car is the only closet you've got. If this story stays with you tonight, subscribe now. There's more coming, and you won't want to miss what she finds inside that building. 6 months in the minivan. Cal called it the whale because it was gray and enormous and swallowed everything they owned. A Dodge Grand Caravan 2009 with 187,000 miles and a rear window that didn't close all the way, which meant every morning there was a thin line of dew across the back seat where Cal slept. Nessa slept in the reclined passenger seat with her feet tucked under the dashboard and a beach towel rolled behind her neck because the headrest had broken off somewhere between Topeka and Salina. She had $18. She had a quarter tank of gas. She had a 7-year-old son who had started referring to meals in the singular. Not breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Just the meal. As in, Mom, are we having the meal before or after the library? Boyd had left 7 months ago. Not the way you leave when you're unhappy, where you sit someone down and say hard things and pack a bag with some dignity attached. Boyd left the way a man leaves when he owes $11,000 to people who don't send letters. He left in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon while Nessa was at work and Cal was at school. Took the truck, took the bank account, took the Xbox for some reason, as if a man fleeing gambling debts needed a gaming console to make the road bearable. He left Nessa the minivan, a stack of overdue bills and a note on the kitchen counter that said, "I'm sorry, I know this is bad." No period at the end, as if the sentence, like Boyd, just stopped. For 3 months, Nessa held on, picked up double shifts at the restaurant, worked prep line dish, whatever they needed, paid rent late, then later, then not at all. The landlord was patient until he wasn't. The eviction notice was 30 days. Nessa used 29 of them trying to find another apartment. On the 30th day, she packed the whale with everything that would fit and told Cal they were going on a trip. That was 6 months ago. The trip had taken them through 4 Kansas towns, 2 shelters with waiting lists longer than her patience, 1 cousin's couch in Hutchinson that lasted 9 days before the cousin's boyfriend made it clear they were unwelcome, and an assortment of parking lots chosen for their distance from streetlights and police patrol routes. Cal, to his credit, complained about almost nothing. He complained when the peanut butter ran out. He complained when the library in Dodge City closed for a week due to a water main break because the library was where he spent most of his days, and he'd been in the middle of a book about Lewis and Clark that he never got to finish. And only once in a Walmart parking lot at 2 in the morning, when a security guard knocked on the window and told them to move, Cal had pressed his face into the seat and said very quietly, "I just want to stop driving." Nessa had put the van in gear and driven to the next lot and parked and sat there with her hands on the wheel until Cal fell back asleep. Then she cried for about 4 minutes, because 4 minutes was what she allowed herself. And then she stopped because crying doesn't fill gas tanks. They came to Grainer because of a rumor. A woman at the shelter in McPherson mentioned a diner that was hiring. Grainer, Kansas. Tiny place, middle of nowhere, but the owner needed a cook and wasn't picky about references. Nessa drove 2 hours on a quarter tank she couldn't afford and pulled into Main Street at 4 in the afternoon on a Wednesday in late May. Main Street in Grainer was 6 blocks long. Hardware store, post office, a bar called the Depot that had a hand-painted sign and a screen door that didn't close all the way. A feed store. A church with a steeple that leaned slightly east as if it had been listening to the wind for so long it forgot to stand up straight. And a diner called Merle's, which had a closed sign in the window and a smaller sign underneath that said permanently. Nessa sat in the van and stared at the signs and felt something shift in her chest. Not break. She was past breaking. Something more like settling the way a foundation settles when the ground beneath it has been slowly washing away for years. A quiet downward motion. Acceptance of gravity. Cal was in the back seat drawing a map on a paper napkin from their last fast food stop. He drew maps of everywhere they went. Not accurate maps, more like feeling maps with big squares for places he liked, and small squares for places he didn't, and arrows pointing to things he thought were interesting. The map of Grainer already had a large square for the church steeple, and an arrow pointing to a cat he'd seen in the hardware store window. Mom, there's a library. 2 blocks east of Main Street, set back from the road behind a small lawn that someone was still bothering to mow. A limestone building with tall windows and a wooden sign that read, Grainer Public Library, in letters that had once been black and were now a dignified gray. Luella Doss was behind the front desk when they walked in, 68 years old, reading glasses on a chain, silver hair cut short and practical. She looked up at Nessa and Cal and did not do the thing that most people did, which was to look at their wrinkled clothes and unwashed hair and assemble a story in their heads about what kind of people they were. Luella just looked at them the way you look at someone who's walked through a door, which is to say without judgment about what's on the other side. Afternoon. Fictions on the left, non-fictions on the right. Bathrooms are down the hall. Water fountains next to the bathrooms. It's cold, so don't let it surprise you. They stayed until closing. Cal read 2 books about prairie animals and started a third about tornadoes. Nessa sat at a computer terminal and searched for jobs within 30 miles and found nothing she hadn't already applied to. When 5 o'clock came and Luella began turning off lights, Nessa found a sandwich sitting on the table where they'd been sitting. Turkey and cheese on white bread wrapped in wax paper. No note, no name. She looked at Luella, who was straightening chairs with her back turned. "You forgot your sandwich." Luella didn't turn around. "I packed 2 by accident this morning." Hate to waste food. She hadn't packed 2 by accident. Nessa knew that. Luella knew Nessa knew. They both understood the rules of this particular transaction, which required that kindness be disguised as carelessness, so that the person receiving it could keep their spine straight. Cal ate the sandwich in the van. Nessa had 3 crackers from a sleeve she'd been rationing for 2 days. That Friday, Luella mentioned the raffle. The town's community center held a charity event every spring. Donated goods, canned food, children's activities, and a raffle. Most of the prizes were modest. Gift cards, household items, a basket of toiletries. But this year, there was what Luella called the grand prize, and the way she said it with her eyebrows slightly raised. and a tone that suggested quotation marks she was too polite to make with her fingers, told Nessa everything. The Strand Mill, 3 stories limestone built 1920. Silo attached. Been empty since the owner died in 2001. City took it for unpaid taxes and has been trying to get rid of it ever since. It's on the raffle because nobody in their right mind would pay money for it. Nessa didn't respond. She was trying to calculate whether the gas to drive to the community center was worth spending. Raffles free. Just show up. The community center was a concrete block building on the west edge of town, folding tables covered in donated clothing and canned goods. A craft table where Cal immediately sat down and started drawing a map of the room. Hot dogs and lemonade served by women who knew each other's names and medical histories. The kind of event where everyone is welcome and everyone knows it and nobody has to say it, because saying it would imply that someone might not have been. Nessa took a raffle ticket, number 309. The woman running the raffle was Dorothy Graves, early 70s. The kind of community volunteer who organized things not because she wanted credit, but because if she didn't, nobody would. She read numbers and handed out prizes and made small jokes that got small laughs. A grocery gift card, a set of kitchen towels, a children's book collection that Cal watched leave the table with visible longing. Then the grand prize. Now, I'll be honest with you. Dorothy's voice carried the careful diplomacy of someone who'd been delivering bad news pleasantly for decades. This one's unusual. The city's donated the deed to the Strand Mill property on Silo Road. Some of you know it. Quiet laughter. A man near the back said something about a haunted grain elevator that got a bigger laugh. It needs work. Dorothy paused in a way that suggested work was doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence. Considerable work. But it's a structure on 7 acres, and it belongs to whoever's number I pull next. More laughter. An old man near the coffee table shook his head and muttered something about the city dumping its problems. His wife elbowed him. Dorothy reached into the bowl, pulled a ticket. Read it once, then again. 309. Cal looked up from his map. Mom, that's you. Nessa walked to the front of the room and took the envelope from Dorothy, who pressed it into her hands with both of hers and said in a voice low enough that only Nessa could hear, "Sometimes the thing nobody wants turns out to be the thing somebody needs." The envelope contained keys, a deed, and a tax clearance certificate. The keys were old heavy, the kind that belonged to locks that were built when people still believed in permanence. They drove to Silo Road the next morning, 7 minutes from Main Street, but it felt farther because the road narrowed and the fields opened up on both sides, flat and enormous wheat, going yellow in the early summer heat. The mill appeared gradually the way big things do on flat land. First, the silo, a gray column against the sky. Then the building itself, 3 stories of Kansas limestone, golden brown, with tall windows on every floor, and a loading dock on the south side where trucks had once backed in with grain. The front door was oak. Warped stuck required Nessa's shoulder and her full weight. When it opened, the smell that came out was 40 years of stillness. Dust, old woodstone, and something underneath that was almost sweet like grain that had been sitting so long it had started returning to the earth. Cal stepped inside first. His sneakers left prints in the dust on the concrete floor. The milling equipment was still there, iron and steel heavy and patient machines that had processed wheat for 65 years and then stopped and never started again. Daylight came through the tall windows at angles that made the dust motes look intentional, like the building was showing them what it was made of. Cal walked slowly through the ground floor, touching machinery, running his hand along a conveyor belt that still held a thin film of flour so old it had turned to powder. He stopped at the base of the stairs and looked up. It's like a castle, but for wheat. Nessa almost smiled. Then she did smile, and it felt unfamiliar on her face, like a language she hadn't spoken in months. The second floor was Dr. Strand's workspace. A wooden desk facing the east windows, a chair pushed back at an angle, papers weighted down by a magnifying glass. Jars of soil samples lined up on a shelf, each labeled with a date and a location in handwriting so precise it looked mechanical. And on the desk, between a stack of agricultural journals and a coffee mug with a ring of residue so old it had fossilized, was a tin box. Cal picked it up. It was light. He shook it, and something shifted inside, dry and whispery. "Mom, can I open it?" "Go ahead." He pried off the lid. Inside, resting on a folded piece of cloth, was a handful of seeds. Wheat kernels. Curled and brown and dry as dust, the husks cracked and splitting. They looked dead. They looked like the botanical equivalent of giving up. "Are these seeds I don't know?" Nessa looked at them. "They look dead." Cal tilted the lid toward the window. On the inside of the tin, scratched into the metal with something sharp, possibly a nail or the tip of a compass, was a line of handwriting. "For whoever stays long enough to plant them." Nessa took the box from Cal's hands, held it, read the words again. The handwriting was small and steady, the writing of someone who had time to think about what they were saying. She ran her thumb across the scratched letters. "Who wrote that?" "I think the man who used to live here." She set the box on the windowsill where the light was strongest. The seeds sat in their tin, curled and patient, not dead but dormant, which is different in ways that matter. That night, they slept in the mill for the first time. Nessa swept the second floor and laid out their sleeping bags on the wooden boards near the east windows. The floor was hard, but it didn't move, which was more than she could say for the whale. Cal fell asleep fast, the way children do when they're somewhere new, and their bodies decide to trust it before their minds catch up. His breathing settled into a rhythm. His map of the mill, unfinished, sat next to his head with the pencil still in his hand. Nessa lay awake and listened to the building. Old structures talk at night. The limestone walls ticked as they cooled. The wooden staircase creaked in the wind. The silo next door made a low humming sound when gusts hit it at certain angles, a sound like a bottle blown across the top, hollow and constant. These were not the sounds of a building falling apart. They were the sounds of a building being itself, doing what it had done for 100 years, standing. In the morning, a man appeared. Nessa heard boots on gravel before she saw him. She went to the window and looked down. A pickup truck, old but maintained, parked near the loading dock. A man in his 70s standing beside it, looking up at the silo with his hands in his jacket pockets, and an expression that was hard to read from 2 stories up. She went downstairs and opened the front door. He was already on his way around the building, not toward the door, but toward the east side, running his hand along the limestone wall. The way you touch something you've been thinking about for a long time. Strand used to leave the east door open for the cats. You should too, or the mice will eat you alive. Who are you? Your neighbor. 3 miles that way. He pointed without looking. I came to see if the mill was still standing. It is. Good. He turned to face her. White hair, clean-shaven hands that had done decades of physical work, and now rested with the stillness of someone who'd earned the right to stop. His eyes went briefly to her sleeping bag, visible through the open door to the van parked in the yard, with children's shoes drying on the dashboard. He processed this information without a single change in his expression. So are you, apparently. He left. Came back 2 hours later with a pipe wrench and a length of copper tubing, and went straight to the ground floor without asking permission. Nessa found him under the utility sink, replacing a corroded valve with the ease of someone who'd done it 1,000 times. She stood in the doorway and watched. I didn't ask for help. You didn't ask for mice either, but they're coming regardless. This valve's been leaking since before you were born. Another month and the floor joists under this section would have rotted through. He slid out from under the sink, wiped his hands on his pants. Griff Tolliver. I was a friend of Avery Strand's. Not a close friend. More like the kind where you wave from your trucks when you pass each other on the road. And once a year you help each other with something heavy. Nessa Caulfield. I know. Luella called me. He saw her face and raised his hand. She didn't tell me your situation. She told me someone moved into the mill and might need a working sink. That's all. He finished the valve, tested it. Water came out brown, then yellow, then clear. Let it run for 10 minutes. Pipes need to remember what they're for. He left again. This time, he didn't come back until the next morning. And when he did, he brought a box of groceries that he left on the loading dock without knocking. Inside the box, on top of a bag of apples and a loaf of bread, was a note in handwriting that was nothing like Dr. Strand's. This one was blocky all capitals, the handwriting of a man who'd spent his career writing field reports and parts lists. It's not charity. Nobody in this county eats store-brand applesauce. I bought too much. Nessa ate an apple standing at the second-floor window looking out at the wheat fields and felt something she almost didn't recognize. Not hope. Not yet. Something before hope. The absence of the specific despair that comes from being entirely alone. It was Cal who found the basement. He'd been mapping the mill obsessively since they moved in, measuring rooms with his feet and converting the steps to what he called Cal units, which were roughly 9 inches each. On the 4th day, he sat on the ground floor with his napkin maps spread around him and frowned. "Mom, the first floor is bigger than the basement." They'd found the basement on day 1. A small room accessed through a door behind the milling equipment. Stone walls, dirt floor, empty except for some shelving and a few rusted tools. Nessa had assumed that was all there was. "What do you mean?" Cal held up his map. "I measured the basement. It's 42 Cal units long and 30 Cal units wide. But the first floor is 60 Cal units long. There's 20 Cal units missing." Nessa looked at the map. Then she looked at the floor. The milling equipment sat on a raised platform on the north end of the ground floor, heavy iron bolted to thick wooden planks. She'd walked across those planks a dozen times. They felt solid, permanent. But Cal's map was insistent. 20 Cal units of floor had nothing under them. They moved a section of loose equipment. Underneath the planks were different. Same wood, same age, but the nails were spaced differently closer together, driven in at slight angles. Nails driven by someone who wanted the boards to stay down. Nessa pried one up with the flat end of a screwdriver, then another. Beneath the planks was darkness and a set of concrete steps going down. She turned on her phone flashlight. Battery at 19%. She went down 7 steps and stopped. The room was the size of a one-car garage. Concrete walls, concrete ceiling. A single bare bulb hanging from a wire that hadn't had power in 20 years. Steel shelving lined 3 walls. On the shelves, document boxes labeled by year. Metal cases that might contain instruments or samples. Dozens of seed packets sealed in what looked like vacuum packaging, each one dated and annotated. And on a small desk pushed against the far wall, a journal. Thick leather bound, the spine cracked from use. Nessa picked up the journal and opened it to the first page. The handwriting was the same as the tin box. Small, precise, patient. "If you found this room, you are either very curious or very desperate. Either way, welcome. I spent 40 years in this building trying to solve a problem that powerful men prefer to remain unsolved. The contents of this room are everything I learned. I leave them to you not because I know who you are, but because I know what it means to need something that nobody else thinks has value. A.S." Nessa sat down on the bottom step. Cal sat next to her, leaning into her side the way he did when he was processing something bigger than his 7 years could hold. "Mom, who's A.S.? The man who built this place. Avery Strand. What was the problem he was trying to solve?" Nessa looked at the shelves, at the boxes and the seed packets and the years of work sealed and labeled and waiting. At the journal in her hands, heavy with answers she didn't yet know the questions to. "I think he was trying to make things grow when everyone said they couldn't." Cal looked at the seed packets. Then he looked up at her. "Like us." Nessa put her arm around him. She didn't answer. Upstairs on the second-floor windowsill, the tin box sat where she'd left it. The dead-looking seeds inside it curled and dry, and 40 years past their expected usefulness waited the way seeds wait. Not knowing whether anyone would come. Not caring. Just holding on to whatever small life was still inside them, in case the soil one day turned out to be right. She didn't know yet what any of it meant. She didn't know about the corporations or the lawsuits or the man in the clean shoes who was already at that moment driving a rented sedan down Route 56 toward Grainer with a folder of land surveys on the passenger seat. She didn't know that the seeds in that tin box were worth more than the building that held them, or that the old man with the pipe wrench would become the closest thing to family she'd had in years. All she knew was this. For the first time in 6 months, she wasn't thinking about where to park for the night. She was thinking about what to do in the morning. And that was different. That was so different it almost felt dangerous, like a muscle she'd stopped using, suddenly being asked to work again. She closed the journal, held it against her chest. Cal had fallen asleep on the step beside her, his head on her arm, his pencil still in his hand. Above them, the mill creaked and settled and hummed its low silo hum. Outside, the Kansas wind moved through the wheat fields in long, slow waves, bending the stalks in unison the way a single breath moves through a room full of people who are all for one quiet moment exhaling at the same time. Griff came back on a Tuesday with a box of journals he'd pulled from his own shelves and a pair of reading glasses. He said his wife hadn't needed since she died. The journals were agricultural quarterlies from the 1970s and 80s. Dog-eared, coffee-stained, the kind of publications that only existed because somewhere in America, there were men who believed soil chemistry was worth arguing about in print. He spread them across Dr. Strand's desk on the second floor and opened the leather-bound journal next to them and began cross-referencing. Nessa watched from the doorway with a mug of instant coffee made from water that still tasted like rust. "What are you looking for?" "Confirmation." Griff didn't look up. He ran his finger down a column of data in the journal, then flipped to a chart in one of the quarterlies. Strand writes about multi-generation selective breeding, taking wheat varieties that survive drought years and crossing them over and over, keeping only the ones that needed less water. 30 years of this. He tapped the journal page. These yield numbers, if they're accurate, are extraordinary. How extraordinary. Griff took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. The morning light through the east windows made the lines on his face look like contour lines on a topographic map. "I spent 35 years at Kansas State Extension telling farmers how to manage water. Every year the aquifer drops. Every year the wells go deeper. Every year someone asks me when it runs out and I say something careful because careful is what you say when the honest answer scares people." He put his glasses back on. Strand's wheat, according to these notes, uses 40 to 60% less water than commercial varieties. If that's real, it changes the math for every farm in western Kansas. That's a big if. It is. But the man kept data like a monk keeps scripture. Every cross, every generation, every rainfall measurement, every yield count. 40 years of it sealed in vacuum packs in your basement. He looked at her. "The seeds are the proof. Everything else is just paper." Nessa thought about the tin box on the windowsill, the curled, dead-looking kernels inside it. She'd moved them to the desk 2 days ago, then moved them back to the windowsill, then picked the box up and held it and set it down again. She hadn't planted anything. Planting felt like a commitment to staying, and she wasn't sure yet whether staying was brave or just another form of being stuck. Griff must have read something in her silence because he went back to the journals without pressing the point. The work of making the mill livable was slower and harder than Nessa had expected, which meant it was exactly as hard as she should have expected, and she'd been fooling herself. The water worked, but the pipes groaned like they were being asked a personal favor every time she turned a faucet. The electrical panel on the ground floor was dead and would stay dead until she could afford an electrician, which meant flashlights after dark and a camp stove for cooking. The windows on the third floor had cracked panes that let in wind and rain equally. The loading dock door hung at an angle that required a specific sequence of lifting, shoving, and swearing to open and close. She cleaned obsessively, not because she cared about aesthetics, but because cleaning was the one thing she could do that produced visible results. Swept the ground floor until the concrete showed through. Scrubbed the second floor windows until the light changed quality, went from gray and filtered to clear and warm. Washed the shelves in the basement room with vinegar and water, handling the seed packets and document boxes with a care that bordered on reverence because she didn't yet understand their value. But she understood that someone had gone to great trouble to preserve them. Cal helped. He swept corners, he carried buckets. He organized Dr. Strand's soil samples by date, then by location, then by some system of his own that he explained in detail and that Nessa pretended to follow. He continued mapping the building, his napkin drawings evolving into something more precise as he refined his Cal unit system with a ruler Griff had given him. Each map included notations that only Cal understood. A star for places where the building made interesting sounds. A circle for places where light came through at specific times of day. An X for the spot on the second floor, where if you stood perfectly still at 7 in the morning, you could hear the silo humming a note that Cal said sounded like the letter O. The diner job that had brought them to Grainer was gone, but Nessa found work within the week. Merle's was closed permanently, but the depot, the bar on Main Street, needed someone to cook lunch 5 days a week. The pay was $12 an hour, no benefits, 30 hours maximum. The owner, a man named Harv, who spoke primarily in sentence fragments, showed her the kitchen on a Monday morning and said what he needed. Burgers, fries, grilled cheese, nothing fancy. Don't burn the fries. People here take fries personally. Nessa took fries personally too. She started Wednesday. Cal went to the library after school let out in June, which was the arrangement Luella offered without being asked. In the same way she'd offered the sandwich by presenting it as something that benefited her rather than them. I could use a reading assistant for the summer program, someone to help the younger kids pick books. Does Cal like books? Cal liked books the way weather liked Kansas, completely, constantly, without negotiation. He started that same Wednesday. Luella paid him in library privileges, which meant he could check out as many books as he could carry, and she slipped him a sandwich at noon that she continued to describe as accidental overproduction. The tin box stayed on the windowsill. Nessa looked at it every morning and every night. The seeds inside it looked the same every time. Patient, unconcerned with her indecision. On a Thursday evening, 2 weeks after they'd moved in, Griff arrived with his notebook full of decoded research and an expression that was different from his usual practiced neutrality. He sat down at Strand's desk and opened the journal to a section near the back that Nessa hadn't reached yet. Strand was more than paranoid. He was right to be. He turned the journal so she could read it. The entries were from 1982 and 1983. The handwriting was the same meticulous script, but the content had shifted from pure science to something darker. Meetings with representatives from agricultural corporations, request to license his seed varieties, polite at first, then insistent, then threatening. Read this one. December 1982. Nessa read aloud, her voice quiet in the stone room. Prairieland sent another man today. Different suite, same offer. They want exclusive rights to the drought-resistant varieties. I explained again that the seeds are meant to be freely available to any farmer who needs them. The man smiled and said that was a beautiful idea, but not a realistic business model. When I asked him to leave, he said I should consider the alternatives. He did not specify what the alternatives were. He didn't need to. Griff flipped forward several pages. January 1983. Funding from the Agricultural Extension Office was denied this morning. No explanation. I called Senator Colburn's office and was told he was unavailable. He has been unavailable for 6 weeks. Prairieland's PAC donated $40,000 to his re-election campaign in November. I am not a conspiracy theorist. I am a man who can read financial disclosures. And then March 1983. Griff's voice dropped. This is where it turns. Legal notice from Prairieland Consolidated delivered by courier. They claim proprietary interest in my seed varieties based on a 1975 grant agreement with the Kansas Agricultural Research Consortium, which they acquired last year. The claim is baseless. The grant funded soil analysis, not breeding research. But their lawyers know what my lawyers know, which is that I can't afford to fight this in court. and they can afford to fight it forever. Nessa sat back. She looked at the shelves of seed packets vacuum-sealed and dated 40 years of work that someone had tried to take and someone else had tried to hide. He went underground. He went underground. Griff closed the journal, built this room, sealed everything inside it, and then he spent the last 18 years of his life pretending to be exactly what the town already thought he was. An odd old man in a grain mill with nothing worth taking. He died knowing it was down here. He died hoping someone would find it. Griff met her eyes. There's a difference. That evening after Cal was asleep, Nessa took the tin box from the windowsill and went downstairs to the loading dock. She sat on the edge with her legs hanging over, looking at the fields. The wheat was turning gold in the last of the June-light acres of it, stretching flat and unbroken to the horizon in every direction. Someone else's wheat. Commercial varieties designed to produce maximum yield with maximum chemical input, sucking the aquifer down another inch every season. She opened the tin. The seeds sat in their cloth nest. Small and still, and impossibly light for things that carried 40 years of someone's life. She didn't plant them that night, but she took one seed out of the tin and held it in her closed fist while she watched the sun finish setting. It was warm from the tin, which was warm from the windowsill, which was warm from the sun. A chain of heat passed from source to source, ending in her hand. The next morning, she filled a clay pot with soil from the garden bed behind the mill, where the earth was dark and had been composting itself for 2 decades. She placed 3 seeds on top, pressed them down with her thumb, covered them with a ½ inch of soil, and watered them with a cup from the kitchen sink. Then she set the pot on the second-floor windowsill where the morning light was strongest and told Cal not to touch it. Cal immediately assigned himself chief watering officer and checked the pot 4 times a day. Nothing happened. A week, 10 days, 2 weeks. The soil stayed dark and flat and silent. Nessa passed the pot every morning on her way downstairs and every evening on her way up, and felt the particular foolishness of a person who has placed hope in a small container and is now watching it not respond. Griff. When he saw the pot, said nothing about it for 3 days. On the 4th day, he picked it up, examined the soil, smelled it, set it back down. Wheat germinates in 7 to 10 days under ideal conditions. Those seeds are 40 years old. Could take longer. Could take never. Thank you. That's very comforting. I'm not here to be comforting. I'm here to be accurate. He paused. But the soil's good. You picked the right spot. He left. Nessa stared at the pot. The soil stared back. On a Wednesday morning in the middle of July, a truck pulled into the mill yard that Nessa didn't recognize. Not Griff's old Ford. A new truck, black with tinted windows and a chrome grille that caught the sun so aggressively it looked like a threat. The man who got out was in his mid-50s. Dark suit, no-tie shoes that had never touched unpaved ground. He carried a leather portfolio and walked toward the mill with the confident stride of someone who had never been told no by a building. Cal was at the library. Nessa was on the ground floor cleaning milling equipment with a wire brush. She heard the boots on the loading dock and came around the corner to find him already inside examining the walls. The equipment, the ceiling, his eyes moving with the efficiency of someone calculating square footage and resale value simultaneously. Nessa Caulfield, who's asking? Nolan Kregg, Prairieland Consolidated. He extended a hand. She didn't take it. He retracted it smoothly as if the gesture had been optional from the start. We understand you recently acquired this property. It was given to me. In a raffle. Right. Kregg smiled. The kind of smile that acknowledged the absurdity of her situation without acknowledging her as a person. Here's the thing, Miss Caulfield. This property sits on a section of the Ogallala Aquifer that's critical to regional irrigation infrastructure. Prairieland has been monitoring water access rights in this area for some time. This is a grain mill. I'm not sitting on a well. You're sitting on the access point for one. Kregg opened his portfolio and removed a document. We'd like to discuss acquisition. $15,000 clean sale, we handle all the paperwork. He held out the document. Nessa looked at it. $15,000. More money than she'd seen in 2 years. Enough to buy a used car that wasn't the whale. Enough for first and last month's rent on an apartment somewhere. Enough to stop. She thought about the seeds in the pot upstairs, the journal in the basement, the words scratched into the tin lid. For whoever stays long enough to plant them. I just got here. That's precisely why we're having this conversation now. Before you get attached. The word attached landed with a weight he hadn't intended. Or maybe he had. Nessa felt something tighten in her chest. Not fear, not anger. Something closer to recognition. She'd heard this before. Not these exact words, but this exact music. The melody of someone explaining to her that what she had wasn't worth keeping. Boyd had played this song when he took the bank account. The landlord had played it when he posted the eviction notice. The cousin's boyfriend had played it when he left the note on the guest pillow. You can't afford this. You're in over your head. Be realistic. She handed the document back. I'm not selling. Kregg studied her. Not surprised, not angry. More like a man who had been told which move his opponent would make and had confirmed it. You'll change your mind when the first bill comes. Maybe. But it hasn't come yet. He left. His truck kicked up dust on the road for a full minute after he was out of sight. That evening, Nessa told Griff about the visit. They were sitting on the loading dock. Cal was inside reading by flashlight, which was how he spent every evening now, stretched out on his sleeping bag with a library book and the headlamp Griff had given him. Griff listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. Prairieland Consolidated was the company that tried to take Strand seeds in '83. I figured. Different name back then. Kansas Agricultural Holdings. Merged with Prairieland in '94. Same people, same playbook. He picked up a piece of limestone that had fallen from the mill wall and turned it over in his hands. They don't want the building. They don't even want the water rights. Not really. They want what's in the basement. They want to make sure nobody ever grows those seeds. How would they know what's in the basement? Griff set the stone down. That's the question, isn't it? 2 days later, the property tax bill arrived. Not in the mail. Hand-delivered to the front door by a county clerk who seemed embarrassed to be there. $3,200, due in 90 days. Nessa held the bill in both hands and did the math. She always did the math of subtraction. The math of what's left after the essentials are paid. She made $1,440 a month cooking at the depot. Rent was $0, but food was $400, gas was $80. Cal's school supplies for the fall were $60, phone bill was $35. That left $865 a month. In 3 months, she could save $2,595. $700 short. $700 between her and losing the mill. She stood in the yard between the building and the silo and held the tax bill and felt the wind coming off the fields and considered for exactly 1 minute calling Nolan Kregg's number on the card he'd left on the loading dock railing. 1 minute, 60 seconds. She counted them. At second 47, the screen door banged open and Cal came running out with the clay pot held in front of him like a chalice. His face split with a grin so wide it changed the geometry of his entire head. "Mom, Mom!" One of them sprouted. She looked at the pot, looked past the dark soil, past the rim down to where a single pale green shoot had broken through, no bigger than an eyelash curled at the tip like a question mark. A 40-year-old seed dead to every reasonable estimation, doing the one thing seeds know how to do when the conditions finally align. She put the tax bill in her back pocket. Let me see. She held the pot in both hands. The shoot was almost translucent, fragile in a way that made her afraid to breathe near it. But it was there, undeniable, leaning toward the window and the light beyond it with the blind determination of a living thing that has decided after decades of patience to begin. She set the pot back on the windowsill, carefully. as if it contained something that could detonate. Cal stood beside her, vibrating. Are we going to plant more? Not yet. Let's see if this one means it. How do you know if it means it? You wait. That weekend, Luella appeared at the mill with a casserole dish and a cat. The cat was orange enormous, named Bushel, and had apparently decided on his own to relocate from the library to the mill, a decision Luella described with the theatrical resignation of a woman who had been outmaneuvered by an animal. He sat in your loading dock for 3 hours yesterday and wouldn't come home. I think he's chosen. I didn't ask for a cat. Nobody asks for Bushel. Bushel asks for you. Consider it a compliment. He's very particular. Bushel walked into the mill, inspected the ground floor, found a spot near the old grain conveyor where sunlight pooled in the afternoon, and lay down with the imperial confidence of an organism that has identified its territory. He did not leave. He did not appear interested in leaving. He appeared interested in sleeping, eating, and occasionally staring at the silo door with an intensity that suggested he was either hunting mice or contemplating the architecture. Cal was thrilled. He added Bushel to his map, immediately marking the cat's preferred sleeping location with a B and a small drawing of a circle with ears. Within the month, more things arrived. A space heater left on the loading dock with no note. A box of canning jars from someone named Maudie Strack, who Nessa had never met but who apparently knew her situation in the way that everyone in a town of 800 knows everyone's situation. A second-hand winter coat for Cal, still in a dry cleaning bag dropped off at the depot during Nessa's shift with a tag that said, "From a friend." Nessa didn't know how to hold any of it. The generosity, the quiet, unsigned, unrequested kindness of people who had decided she belonged without asking her permission. She'd spent 6 months being invisible. Now she was being seen, and the seeing came not with judgment, but with casseroles and coats and a cat who purred like a diesel engine. She didn't cry. She'd used up her crying allocation months ago. But she stood on the loading dock one evening after Cal was asleep, holding the winter coat that a stranger had bought for her son, and she pressed it against her face and breathed into it and let the clean fabric smell fill her lungs. And she stayed like that for a while. Bushel sat beside her watching the fields, his tail curling and uncurling like a question he already knew the answer to. The shoot in the pot became 2 shoots, then 3. Then a cluster of thin green blades reaching for the glass, pale but insistent, growing a 1/4 inch a day. Cal recorded their height every morning with the ruler Griff had given him. He made a chart. He named the tallest one Hank after his favorite library book character. Griff, when he saw the growth, stood at the windowsill for a long time without speaking. Then he picked up the pot and examined the root structure visible through the drainage hole at the bottom. Strong roots. Strand would have liked that. On a Friday evening in late August, Kregg came back. This time he wasn't alone. A woman in a gray suit sat in his passenger seat, a leather briefcase on her lap. She stayed in the truck. Kregg approached the loading dock, where Nessa was sitting with the journal, making notes in the margins of her own notebook, trying to understand the seed genealogy chart Strand had drawn. "Ms. Caulfield." Kregg's smile was thinner this time. "We've reviewed the property records. There's an easement on the north boundary that grants access to subsurface water resources. Our legal team believes this supersedes your surface property rights." Nessa closed the journal. "You're telling me you own the water under my building. I'm telling you there's a legal argument to be made. One that would involve extended litigation, which you can't afford." He glanced at the mill, at the windows Nessa had cleaned at the loading dock. She'd swept at the small signs of habitation that had accumulated over 2 months. "This building is falling apart and you know it. Sell before it buries you. The building's been standing since 1920. I think it can wait a little longer." Kregg's eyes shifted to the second-floor window. The pot of seedlings was visible from below, green against the glass. "What are you growing up there, Wheat?" Something moved behind his expression. A flicker. Fast enough to miss if you weren't watching for it. But Nessa was watching. "Wheat. In a flower pot. Thought I'd try." Kregg looked at her. Looked at the pot. Looked at the journal in her hands. The flicker became something harder, a calculation she could almost see happening. "We're prepared to increase our offer. 40,000. Final." Nessa stood up. The journal was heavy in her hand. The tax bill was on the desk upstairs, $700 short of solved. 40,000 would solve it and everything else. A new start, a real apartment, school supplies that weren't second-hand, a car that didn't smell like the last 6 months of their lives. She looked down at the yard where Cal had scratched a map of the property into the dirt with a stick. She looked at the silo, gray and permanent against the evening sky. She looked at Bushel, asleep on the loading dock in a square of fading sunlight. No. Kregg's jaw tightened. Griff stepped around the corner of the building. He'd arrived during the conversation, parked his truck out of sight, approached on foot. He stood with his hands in his jacket pockets, positioned between Kregg and the mill door. "You heard her." Kregg looked at Griff the way you look at an obstacle that shouldn't be there. "You're advising her. An old man with nothing better to do. I'm an old man with nothing to lose. That's worse for you." Kregg turned back to Nessa. One last look, measuring her, deciding something. "You should know that easement filing goes to the county next week. Once it's in the system, this gets complicated in ways that a cook at a bar and a retired farmer can't uncomplicate." He walked to his truck. The woman in the gray suit looked at Nessa through the window as they pulled away. Her expression was not hostile. It was the expression of someone watching a small animal cross a highway and calculating the odds. After the dust settled, Griff sat down on the loading dock beside Nessa. Bushel relocated to Griff's lap without being invited and began purring. "An easement filing." Griff rubbed Bushel's ears. "That's aggressive. They're trying to establish a legal claim to force you into selling or to make the property unmarketable. Either way, you can't fight it without a lawyer. I can't afford a lawyer. No. But my friend's niece just graduated from Washburn Law in Topeka and passed the bar in May. She's looking for pro bono work to build her practice. Name's Tilde Reinhardt. Bright kid, persistent as hell. You just happen to know a lawyer. I'm 74 years old. I know at least one of everything." Nessa looked at the fields. The wheat was almost ready for harvest, heavy and gold-bending in the evening wind, in those long, slow waves that made the whole landscape look like it was breathing. Somewhere underneath all that wheat, the aquifer sat in darkness, dropping an inch a year, feeding a system that was draining it faster than rain could fill it back up. And in her building, in a clay pot on a windowsill, a 40-year-old solution was growing its first real leaves. She picked up the journal and held it the way she had been holding it every evening for weeks. Against her chest, close enough to feel the weight of it, the heft of a man's entire working life distilled to measurements and observations, and the stubborn repetition of trying. The wind picked up. The silo hummed its low Bushel kneaded Griff's thigh with his enormous paws. "Griff, what happens if the seeds work? If they really are what Strand said they were? Then you've got something that prairie land can't buy and can't bury. Proof that grows out of the ground. You can suppress a paper. You can bury a patent. But you can't argue with a crop standing in a field using half the water of everything around it." Nessa nodded slowly. She looked at the pot on the windowsill above them, barely visible from below, just a dark shape against the lit window. "Then I need to plant more than 3 seeds. You need to plant a field." The word field hung between them. A field was not a pot on a windowsill. A field was commitment. A field was visible from the road. A field was a declaration made in soil and seed that she was staying and meant it and was willing to stake something real on the future of a dead man's 40-year-old theory. She didn't say yes, she didn't say anything. But she didn't say no either. And Griff, who had spent 74 years learning the difference between silence that means no and silence that means I'm working up to it, simply sat there with the cat on his lap and the wind in the wheat and the silo humming its single low note as the light drained out of the Kansas sky, slow and steady, the way it always does on flat land. because out here there's nothing to stop the sun from taking its time. Tilda Reinhardt drove a Honda Civic with a cracked windshield and a back seat full of law textbooks she hadn't gotten around to returning. She was 26 and wore her hair in a braid that she pulled over one shoulder when she was thinking, and she thought constantly. She arrived at the mill on a Monday morning, 3 days after Griff's call, carrying a canvas bag stuffed with property law casebooks and a yellow legal pad that already had 6 pages of notes. Nessa met her on the loading dock. Tilda shook her hand with a grip that belonged to someone who had been underestimated before and had developed strong handshakes as a countermeasure. Griff says you've got a corporation trying to take your water rights through a fabricated easement. That's the short version. I like the short version. Can I see the deed? They sat at Strand's desk. Tilda read the deed twice, made notes, then asked to see the journal entries about Prairieland's 1983 legal threats. She read those 3 times. Her braid came over her shoulder and stayed there for 40 minutes. This easement they're filing, it's based on a 1971 water access agreement between the original mill owner and the county. But that agreement was superseded when the property changed hands in 1974. Strand bought the mill outright free and clear. The county's own records show the easement was extinguished at transfer. She looked up. Prairieland knows this. They're banking on you not having a lawyer who can find a 40-year-old transfer document in the county archives. Can you find it? I already called the county clerk's office on the drive here. They're pulling the file. Nessa felt something loosen in her chest. Not relief yet. More like the first breath after being underwater. There's something else. Tilda set down her pen. Strand's research. The seed varieties, the breeding data, the agricultural methodology. All of it was created on this property with private funding by a sole proprietor. It belongs to whoever owns the mill. That's you. Prairieland's 1983 claim was based on a grant agreement that funded soil analysis, not plant breeding. The scope was explicitly limited. She held up a photocopy she'd made from the journal. Strand even noted it himself. Paragraph 4, Section 2 of the grant agreement limits consortium interest to soil composition data. Seeds, cultivars, and breeding methodology are excluded. So they never had a claim. They had a threat. That's different. A claim requires legal standing. A threat just requires money and the assumption that the other person can't fight back. Tilda stayed for 3 hours. She photographed every relevant document in the basement. She made a timeline. She drafted a response to the easement filing that she said she'd submit to the county by end of week. Before she left, she stood in the doorway and looked at the pot of seedlings on the windowsill. Now a thick cluster of green blades 8 inches tall, bending slightly toward the glass. Griff tells me those are Strand's drought-resistant wheat. 3 of them, 40 years old. Tilda nodded slowly. Plant more. If this goes to any kind of hearing, a living demonstration is worth more than 1,000 pages of data. The next morning, Nessa went to the basement alone. She stood in front of the shelves of vacuum-sealed seed packets and counted them. 47 packets, each one labeled with a year, a generation number, and a code that corresponded to Strand's breeding charts. The earliest was from 1968, the latest 1998. 30 years of iteration. 30 years of a man alone in a grain mill, crossing and recrossing, selecting and reselecting, building something one generation at a time. She picked up the 1998 packet, the most recent, the culmination. She held it the way you hold a decision that hasn't been made yet, feeling the weight of the seeds through the plastic light and dry a handful of grain that might mean nothing or might mean everything. She carried it upstairs and out to the garden plot behind the mill, where she'd been clearing soil for weeks without admitting to herself why. The ground was dark, composted by 20 years of fallen leaves and grass. She knelt down and opened the packet and poured the seeds into her palm. There were maybe 200 of them, enough for a small plot. Not a field, a test. She planted them in rows, spacing them the way Griff had shown her from the Extension Service guidelines he still kept in his truck. pressed each one down with her thumb, covered them, watered them from the hose Griff had connected to the outdoor spigot the week before. Cal watched from the loading dock, recording the date and the number of rows in his notebook. How long until they grow, if they grow? 7 to 10 days. They grew in 6. Green lines appeared in the dark soil like stitches in fabric, thin and pale and impossibly straight. One row, then another. Then all of them 200 seeds sending up shoots in the Kansas September sun. And Nessa stood at the edge of the plot at dawn on the 7th day and counted the rows and felt something rise in her throat that she hadn't felt since before Boyd, before the van, before the gas station bathroom, and the hand dryer and the blue shirt puffing up like a ghost. She felt like she was enough. Not because of the seeds, not because of the mill or the journal or the legal filing or any single thing. Because she had stayed. She had been told to leave by a man in clean shoes, and she had stayed. And the staying itself was the thing, the act of putting a seed in the ground and deciding to be there when it came up. Kregg's easement filing was rejected by the county on a Thursday in late September. Tilda's brief was 4 pages long and cited the 1974 transfer document, the limited scope of the original grant agreement, and 3 Kansas Supreme Court precedents on extinguished water access rights. The county clerk, who had been quietly uncomfortable with the filing from the beginning, processed the rejection in 24 hours. Kregg did not come back to the mill. Instead, his response came through lawyers. A letter arrived the following week addressed to Nessa, asserting that the Strand mill posed structural safety hazards and requesting that the county order an inspection with the goal of condemnation. Tilda called Nessa that evening. He's switching tactics. If he can't take the water, he'll try to take the building. A condemnation order would force you out and put the property back on the market. Can he do that? He can request an inspection. Whether it leads to condemnation depends on the inspector's report. She paused. Do you know a structural engineer now? But I know someone who spent 35 years inspecting agricultural buildings for the state of Kansas. The town hall hearing was on a Tuesday in mid-October. The room was small wood-paneled with folding chairs arranged in rows facing a table where 3 county commissioners sat. Nessa had expected the room to be mostly empty. She was wrong. Luella was there in the second row with Bushel in a carrier on her lap because she said he had separation anxiety, which was not true, but nobody argued with the librarian. Half from the depot was there still in his kitchen apron, having closed the bar for the afternoon with a sign that said, "Gone to support a neighbor." Maudie Strack was there. The woman who'd left the winter coat was there, and Nessa still didn't know her name, and the woman smiled at her from across the room, and Nessa smiled back, and that was enough. Kregg sat in the front row with the woman in the gray suit who turned out to be a structural engineer hired by Prairie Land. She presented her report first. The mill had foundation cracks, she said. Load-bearing walls were compromised. The roof structure showed evidence of deterioration. In her professional opinion, the building was unsafe for habitation. Griff stood when it was his turn. He wore a clean flannel shirt and his reading glasses and carried a folder that was thicker than the engineer's entire report. He introduced himself as a licensed professional engineer, retired Kansas PE license number 4471 active and in good standing. He presented his own structural assessment conducted over the course of 8 weeks with photographs, measurements, and load calculations. This building was constructed from native limestone quarried 2 miles north of here. The walls are 18 inches thick. The foundation is poured concrete reinforced with railroad iron, which was standard practice in 1920 and remains structurally superior to most modern residential foundations. He turned a page. The cracks Ms. Alderman identified are surface-level weathering, consistent with a 100-year-old building that has been unmaintained for 2 decades. They do not affect structural integrity. I've included load-bearing calculations for every wall she flagged. He set the folder on the commissioner's table. This mill was built by people who expected it to outlast them. It has, it will, The commissioners deliberated for 9 minutes. The condemnation request was denied 4-1. Outside the town hall in the parking lot, Kregg walked past Nessa without speaking. The engineer followed. They got into the black truck and drove east on Main Street and turned onto the highway, and the truck became a small dark shape against the wheat fields. And then it was gone. Nessa stood in the parking lot and breathed. Griff appeared beside her folder under his arm, Bushel's carrier in his other hand, because Luella had handed it to him without explanation. "You all right?" "I don't know what I am, but I'm still here." That's usually enough. 3 weeks later, the results came back from Kansas State. Dr. Maren Pruitt was a crop scientist at the university, 40 years old. Quiet in the way that people are quiet when they spend most of their time listening to plants. She'd read about the Strand mill in a small article in the Grainer Weekly newspaper, written by a reporter who had attended the town hall hearing, and found the story more interesting than the usual zoning disputes. She contacted Nessa through Luella, because in Grainer all communication eventually routed through the library. She came to the mill on a Saturday, examined the seed packets, the journals, the breeding charts. She took samples from the growing test plot. She took samples from the sealed packets in the basement. She spent 4 hours in the hidden room and emerged looking like a person who had just found a room she'd been looking for her entire career. 4 weeks later, she called. The results were preliminary but unambiguous. Strand's 1998 generation wheat demonstrated 43% greater drought tolerance than the leading commercial variety with 55% reduced water requirements under controlled conditions. The root structure was deeper, the tillering more aggressive, the grain quality comparable. These numbers are remarkable. Dr. Pruitt's voice was measured scientific, deliberately restrained in the way that scientists are restrained when they're trying not to shout. If this holds up in field trials, this is the most significant development in dryland wheat cultivation in 40 years. She published a preliminary paper. The agricultural press picked it up, then the regional press, then the wire services. Within 2 weeks, Prairieland Consolidated issued a statement through their communications department announcing that they had no current interest in the Strand Mill property and wished Miss Caulfield well in her agricultural endeavors. The statement did not mention the easement filing, the condemnation attempt, or the 50 years they'd spent suppressing the research they were now graciously declining to claim. Tilda read the statement aloud to Nessa over the phone. Translation they're running. A story about a corporation burying drought-resistant wheat while the aquifer drops is not a story they want told. Especially not right now with half of western Kansas in water restrictions. Kregg's name never appeared in the Grainer paper again. His business card, the one he'd left on the loading dock railing 3 months earlier, sat in a drawer in Strand's desk. Nessa kept it, not out of anger, out of the particular satisfaction of knowing that a piece of paper with a man's name on it can sit in a drawer indefinitely, without meaning anything at all. On a Saturday morning in early November, Nessa found the letter. She'd been going through the journal again slowly, the way you reread something when you've stopped looking for information and started looking for the person behind it. The pages near the back were stuck together with age. She'd left them alone for months, assuming they were blank. But that morning, with the light coming through the clean windows at the right angle, she saw the edge of a folded paper caught between 2 pages that had fused at the corners. She separated them carefully with a butter knife. The letter was written on plain paper, folded, once dated February 2001, 1 month before Strand died. She read it standing at the desk, the morning quiet around her. Cal still asleep upstairs, Bushel draped across the warm spot on the floor where the sun pooled at 9 o'clock. To whoever found this room. I spent 40 years trying to make this land grow without bleeding the water table dry. The companies wanted farmers dependent. I wanted farmers free. I lost. But seeds don't know they've lost. They just wait. If you're reading this, plant them. Not because they're worth money. Because every time something grows that wasn't supposed to, it proves that giving up is a choice, not an outcome. I don't know who you are. I hope you needed this place. I hope it needed you back. Avery Strand, February 2001. Nessa set the letter on the desk. She pressed her palms flat against the wood, feeling the grain under her hands. The desk where a man had sat for 40 years writing down everything he knew, in the hope that someday it would matter to someone he would never meet. She stood there for a long time, not crying, past crying. In the territory beyond crying where the feeling is too large for the body's usual responses, and you just have to stand still and let it move through you like wind through an open building. Cal came downstairs in his socks hair, sticking up notebook in hand. Mom, are you okay? Nessa turned around. Come here. I want to read you something. She read him the letter. Cal listened with his whole body the way 7-year-olds listen when they know something important is happening, even if they can't name it. Mom, did Dr. Strand know we were coming? No, baby. He just hoped someone would. Cal thought about this. Then he looked at the pot on the windowsill. The original 3 seedlings, now tall and golden, ready for harvest, their heads heavy with grain. Can we save some seeds from those ones and plant them next year? Nessa looked at her son, at his serious face and his notebook and his hair that needed cutting, and his socks that didn't match because matching socks was a luxury they hadn't gotten back to yet. Yeah, we can do that. Spring came the way it comes to flatland all at once, the brown fields turning green in a matter of days, as if the earth had been holding its breath since November and finally let go. Nessa planted the South Acre in March, using seeds from the basement and seeds harvested from her windowsill crop, first-generation descendants of Strand's 40-year-old originals. Griff helped with the planting. Cal helped with the watering. Bushel supervised from the loading dock with the detached authority of management. Kansas State sent graduate students to monitor the field trial. Dr. Pruitt came once a month to collect data. The plants emerged in even rows, green and steady, pushing through the sandy Kansas topsoil with the quiet insistence of things that have been waiting a long time to be asked. By June, the wheat was knee-high. By July, it was waist-high on Nessa and chest-high on Cal, who measured it against himself every morning and recorded the ratio in his notebook. Griff sat on the loading dock in the evenings and watched it move in the wind and sometimes said things and sometimes didn't. Bushel sat beside him, an orange comma against the limestone wall. The mill was not finished. The third-floor windows still needed replacing. The electrical system was half done, funded by a small grant from the State Historical Preservation Office that Tilda had applied for without telling Nessa. The silo needed repointing. The loading dock needed new boards. There was always something. But the second floor was home. Nessa's room faced east toward the fields. Cal's room faced west toward the road and the town beyond it. His maps covered every wall maps of the mill maps, of grainer maps, of the property maps of places he'd been and places he wanted to go. The newest map pinned above his bed was a drawing of the wheat field, with each row labeled by seed generation, and a legend in the corner that explained his color-coding system. On a Saturday in late July, the wheat was ready. Nessa stood at the edge of the field at dawn and looked at it. Gold, dense, moving in the wind in those long, slow waves that she'd watched from the loading dock for a year. Except now they were her waves, her wheat, her 40-year-old inheritance made new. Cal came out with the ruler. He measured a stalk against himself. Mom, it's taller than me. Nessa was in the doorway. Coffee in her hand, the morning light coming through the kitchen window behind her, and catching the dust motes in the air the way it always did, making the ordinary visible. Give it time. So are you. Griff pulled up in his truck at 7. He got out slow the way he did everything now, and stood at the edge of the field with his hands in his pockets. The wheat moved around him. The wind carried the smell of it, dry and sweet and warm, the smell of grain that has done everything it was designed to do. He didn't speak for a long time. When he did, his voice was rough. 40 years in that basement, and look at it. Nessa stood beside him. Cal stood beside her. Bushel sat on the loading dock railing, his tail curling and uncurling in the slow rhythm of an animal at peace with the scope of the morning. The silo hummed. The wind moved. The wheat bent and straightened, 200 rows of living proof that what powerful men bury doesn't always stay buried. That patience is not passivity. That a seed in a sealed packet in a dark room under a stone building in the middle of Kansas can hold on to its small life for 4 decades, and still when the soil is right and the water comes, and someone bothers to kneel down and press it into the earth with their thumb, do the one thing it was always meant to do: grow. Tell us in the comments, have you ever held on to something everyone told you to throw away? A seed, a skill, a stubborn belief that wouldn't quit. Did it ever surprise you by coming back to life when you finally gave it the right conditions? We read every one. And if this story stayed with you tonight, if it settled somewhere in your chest like grain, settling in a silo, subscribe. The next one might be about a piece of ground you recognize, or a box you've been keeping, or something you planted a long time ago that you forgot to check on.